The morning sun cast long shadows across the London streets as James Mitchell adjusted his worn leather jacket and checked his watch one final time. At 62 years old, his weathered hands still carried the steadiness that had once guided him through the most dangerous missions of his military career. The Victoria Cross Medal, Britain's highest military honor, sat quietly in a small wooden box tucked safely in his carry-on bag. Today marked a special journey. He was flying to Edinburgh to attend a ceremony honoring fallen comrades from his regiment. James had served in the Royal Guards for over 3 decades, earning his Victoria Cross during a classified operation in Afghanistan, where he had single-handedly rescued 8 wounded soldiers from behind enemy lines. The citation read simply, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepid devotion to duty." Those few words could never capture the terror, the split-second decisions, or the weight of responsibility he had carried that day. But James never spoke about it, not even to his wife Margaret, who had passed away 2 years earlier. The taxi ride to Heathrow Airport gave him time to reflect on the past months. Since Margaret's death, the house had felt impossibly large and quiet. Their children lived abroad, Sarah in Australia working as a doctor and Michael in Canada running his own business. The upcoming ceremony would be his first major social gathering since the funeral, and he felt both nervous and honored to represent his fallen brothers in arms. At the airport, James approached the check-in counter with his ticket clutched in his arthritic fingers. He had booked an economy seat, as he always did, believing in living modestly despite the small military pension that kept him comfortable. The young woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Sophie, barely looked up as she processed his boarding pass. "Any bags to check, sir?" she asked mechanically, her attention already drifting to the next passenger in line. "Just this carry-on," James replied politely, lifting his small black bag. "I have some important items that need to stay with me." Sophie nodded without interest and handed him his boarding pass. James noticed she had assigned him a middle seat near the back of the plane, despite checking in early. He considered asking about it, but decided against causing any fuss. Military training had taught him to adapt to any situation without complaint. The security line moved slowly, giving James time to observe the diverse crowd of travelers around him. Families with excited children heading off on holidays, business, people typing urgently on their phones, and elderly couples like he and Margaret used to be, holding hands and sharing quiet conversations. The sight brought a familiar ache to his chest, but he pushed the sadness aside. Margaret would want him to honor their friends today. When James reached the security checkpoint, the metal detector beeped as he walked through. The security officer, a stern-faced man in his 30s, motioned for him to step aside. "Sir, please empty all metal items from your pockets and step through again." James complied, removing his simple wedding ring, a few coins, and his military identification card. The detector remained silent this time, but the officer's eyes had caught sight of the ID card. "Military?" the officer asked, his tone softening slightly. "Retired," James confirmed with a modest nod. "Royal Guards." The officer's demeanor changed noticeably. His father had served in the Royal Navy, and he had deep respect for service members. "Thank you for your service, sir. Have a safe flight." As James collected his belongings, he noticed other passengers glancing at him with curiosity. His military bearing was still evident despite his civilian clothes, the straight posture, the alert eyes that took in every detail of his surroundings, the quiet confidence that came from decades of training and experience. But to most people, he simply looked like another elderly passenger, perhaps a grandfather traveling to visit family. The departure gate was crowded when James arrived. He found an empty seat near the window and settled in to wait for boarding. Around him, conversations buzzed about business deals, vacation plans, and family matters. A young mother struggled with her crying toddler while juggling multiple bags, and James instinctively half rose to offer assistance before she managed to calm the child on her own. The flight crew arrived at the gate, wheeling their smart black luggage behind them. James watched them with professional interest, noting their efficient movements and crisp uniforms. In his military days, he had worked closely with RAF personnel and had always admired their precision and professionalism. He hoped the commercial airline would maintain similar standards. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair and an air of self-importance, began the boarding announcement. We will now begin boarding flight BA 1247 to Edinburgh. First-class passengers and premium members may board now. A small group of well-dressed passengers approached the gate, their expensive luggage and designer clothes marking them as the airline's preferred customers. James watched as they were greeted with bright smiles and enthusiastic assistance. The gate agent's voice took on a noticeably warmer tone as she processed their boarding passes. Business-class passengers may now board, came the next announcement. Another wave of travelers moved forward, though the gate agent's enthusiasm seemed slightly diminished compared to her treatment of first-class passengers. James remained seated, knowing his boarding group would be called last. He used the time to check once more that his carry-on was securely closed and that the precious cargo inside, not just his Victoria Cross but also photographs of his fallen comrades and letters from their families, was safe. These items represented more than personal belongings. They were sacred reminders of sacrifice and brotherhood that transcended civilian understanding. Finally, the gate agent called for general boarding. James joined the line of remaining passengers, mostly families and elderly travelers like himself. As he approached the gate, he noticed the agent's demeanor had become noticeably cooler and more mechanical. The bright smiles and warm greetings were reserved for the premium passengers who had already boarded. "Boarding pass," the agent said curtly when James reached the front of the line. As James handed over his ticket, he had no idea that this simple transaction would set in motion a series of events that would eventually reach the highest levels of the British monarchy. All he knew was that he was one step closer to honoring his fallen brothers, carrying with him the weight of their memory and the quiet dignity of a man who had served his country with distinction, expecting nothing more than the basic respect due to any fellow human being. The narrow airplane aisle stretched before James as he made his way toward his assigned seat, clutching his boarding pass and carry-on bag. The contrast between the front and back of the aircraft was stark. He had walked past the spacious first class, seats with their leather upholstery and attentive flight attendants offering champagne and warm towels, through the slightly cramped but still comfortable business class section, and now into the economy cabin where every inch of space seemed to be maximized for profit rather than comfort. His seat, 32B, was exactly where he had feared it would be, sandwiched between a large businessman who had already claimed both armrests and a nervous young woman who kept checking her phone anxiously. The businessman, dressed in an expensive suit and sporting a gold watch that probably cost more than James's monthly pension, looked up with obvious irritation as James approached. "Excuse me," James said politely, gesturing toward the middle seat. The businessman sighed dramatically and made an exaggerated show of moving his laptop bag and jacket, as if James's presence was a personal inconvenience. He didn't bother to acknowledge James's quiet "thank you" as he squeezed into the cramped space. As James settled into his seat, he noticed how different the service was in this section of the plane. The flight attendants, who had been warm and attentive in first class, moved through economy with rushed efficiency, their smiles noticeably strained. When they reached his row during the pre-flight safety check, they barely made eye contact. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule, and James gazed out the small window as London grew smaller beneath them. He thought about Margaret, who had always loved flying and would press her face to the window like an excited child, pointing out landmarks and making up stories about the people in the houses below. The memory brought both comfort and sadness. Halfway through the flight, James needed to use the restroom. The businessman beside him had fallen asleep and was sprawled across both his seat and part of James's space, making it difficult to get up. James gently tapped the man's shoulder. "Excuse me, sir. I need to get past." The businessman woke with a start and glared at James as if he had committed some grave offense. "Can't you wait until I'm awake?" he snapped, making no effort to move. "I apologize for the inconvenience," James replied with the patience learned from decades of military discipline. Grudgingly, the businessman shifted slightly, and James carefully maneuvered into the aisle. As he made his way toward the back of the plane, he passed through the business class section again. Here, passengers were enjoying their meals on real plates with metal cutlery, while he had been served a stale sandwich in a plastic wrapper. The restroom queue was long, and James waited patiently behind several other economy passengers. He struck up a brief conversation with an elderly woman who was traveling to see her new grandchild. She mentioned how different air travel had become over the years, how passengers used to dress up for flights and treat each other with courtesy. "It's all about money now," she said sadly. "If you don't pay extra for everything, they treat you like you're not even human." When James returned to his seat, he found that his carry-on bag, which he had carefully stowed in the overhead compartment, had been moved. A flight attendant was trying to cram a large designer suitcase into the space. "Excuse me," James said politely. "I believe that's where my bag was stored." The flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and a pinched expression, barely glanced at him. "This passenger's bag wouldn't fit anywhere else," she said dismissively. "Yours has been moved to a compartment further back." James felt a flutter of concern. His bag contained irreplaceable items: his Victoria Cross, photographs of fallen comrades, and letters from their families. These weren't just personal belongings. They were precious historical artifacts and memorials to brave men who had died serving their country. "That bag contains some very important military items," James explained calmly. "Could you please tell me exactly where it's been moved?" The flight attendant's expression hardened. "Sir, all bags are treated equally. Your items aren't more important than anyone else's." The dismissive tone stung, but James maintained his composure. "I understand, but these are irreplaceable military honors and—" "Look," the flight attendant interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "I don't have time to deal with every passenger's special requests. Your bag is safe somewhere in the overhead storage. That's all I can tell you." Several passengers had begun to stare, and James felt heat rising in his cheeks, not from anger, but from embarrassment at being spoken to so rudely in public. The businessman beside him smirked, apparently enjoying the spectacle. "Perhaps I could just quickly check on my bag," James suggested, starting to move toward the back of the plane. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," the flight attendant commanded. "The seatbelt sign is on and you're creating a safety hazard." James looked up and saw that the seatbelt sign was indeed illuminated, though he hadn't noticed any turbulence. He had no choice but to comply. But his anxiety about his precious cargo continued to grow. In all his years of military service, he had never lost or misplaced any equipment under his care. The thought that his Victoria Cross and memorial items might be damaged or lost was almost unbearable. As he squeezed back into his middle seat, the businessman made no effort to move his belongings, forcing James to sit at an uncomfortable angle. The young woman on his other side was now openly staring at him, having overheard the entire exchange with the flight attendant. "That was really rude," she whispered to James. "I'm sorry they treated you that way." James smiled gratefully at her. Kindness. "Thank you, dear. It's quite all right." But it wasn't all right. For a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, who had risked everything to save his fellow soldiers, who had been honored by his country with its highest military decoration, being treated with such casual disrespect was deeply hurtful, not because he expected special treatment, but because he had hoped for basic human courtesy. The flight continued, and James found himself unable to concentrate on the book he had brought. His mind kept returning to his bag, somewhere in the maze of overhead compartments containing items that represented the sacrifice of men, far braver than himself. These weren't just medals and photographs. They were tangible connections to brothers in arms who would never see another sunrise. As the plane began its descent into Edinburgh, James prepared to face what he expected would be another frustrating interaction with the airline staff. He had no way of knowing that his quiet dignity in the face of such treatment had not gone entirely unnoticed, or that word of his experience was already beginning to spread through channels he never could have imagined. The wheels touched down on Scottish soil, and James said a silent prayer that he would be reunited with his precious cargo intact. Tomorrow's ceremony suddenly felt more important than ever, not just as a tribute to fallen heroes, but as a reminder of the values of honor and respect that seemed to be disappearing from the world. The plane came to a complete stop at Edinburgh Airport, and James remained seated as the familiar chaos of disembarkation began around him. First-class passengers were already standing and collecting their belongings, while economy passengers waited impatiently in the aisle. James watched anxiously as overhead compartments opened throughout the aircraft, hoping to catch a glimpse of his black carry-on bag. The same flight attendant who had dismissed his concerns earlier was now helping premium passengers retrieve their luggage with exaggerated care and bright smiles. James waited until most of the passengers had deplaned before approaching her once more. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Could you please help me locate my bag, the black one that was moved during the flight?" The flight attendant looked at him with obvious irritation, as if his very presence was an inconvenience. "Sir, I told you before, all bags are stored safely. Just check all the compartments." James began systematically opening overhead bins, many of which were now empty. Other passengers pushed past him impatiently, eager to leave the aircraft. The businessman from his row brushed against him roughly without so much as an apology, wheeling his expensive luggage toward the exit. After checking nearly every compartment in the economy section, James felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. His bag was nowhere to be found. The photographs of his fallen comrades, his Victoria Cross, the letters from grateful families, all of it seemed to have vanished. "I can't find my bag anywhere," James told the flight attendant, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing panic. She sighed dramatically. "It probably ended up in the cargo hold if there wasn't room overhead. You'll need to check at baggage claim." "But it was carry-on luggage," James protested. "It was never supposed to go to cargo." "These things happen," she replied with a shrug, already turning her attention to cleaning up the cabin. "The ground crew will sort it out." James made his way off the plane with a heavy heart, joining the stream of passengers heading toward baggage claim. His military training had taught him to prepare for every contingency, but he had never imagined that a simple domestic flight could result in losing items that were literally irreplaceable. At the baggage claim area, James approached the airline's customer service desk where a young man named David was processing complaints from other disgruntled passengers. When James's turn came, he explained his situation calmly and thoroughly. "Let me check our system," David said, typing on his computer. After several minutes, he looked up with confusion. "I don't show any record of your bag being transferred to cargo. Are you sure you had it with you on the plane?" James felt a flash of irritation but maintained his composure. "Yes, I'm quite certain. I watched the flight attendant move it to make room for another passenger's bag." David continued typing, his frown deepening. "This is unusual. Let me call the aircraft cleaning crew to see if anything was left behind." While David made his calls, James stood to the side and watched other passengers reuniting with their luggage or arguing about lost items. A well-dressed woman was loudly berating another customer service agent about her delayed designer handbag, threatening to sue the airline and demanding compensation. The stark contrast between her treatment and his own was not lost on James. "Sir?" David called him back over. "The cleaning crew says they found nothing unusual on the aircraft. Are you absolutely certain your bag made it onto the plane?" James closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back frustration. "Young man, I watched it go into the overhead compartment with my own eyes. I've been traveling for 60 years and I know the difference between having a bag and not having one." Something in James's tone must have registered with David because his demeanor became more respectful. "Of course, sir. Let me escalate this to my supervisor. Can you describe the contents of the bag?" James hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. "It contained my Victoria Cross medal, along with several photographs and letters related to fallen soldiers from my regiment. These items are irreplaceable and of significant historical value." David's eyes widened. "You have a Victoria Cross?" "Sir, that's incredibly significant. Let me get my manager right away." Within minutes, a woman named Sarah appeared, the customer service manager for the airline. She listened to James's story with growing concern, especially when she learned about the nature of the missing items. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, This is absolutely unacceptable. A Victoria Cross is one of Britain's most sacred military honors. We need to find your bag immediately. Sarah made several urgent phone calls, speaking to flight crew, ground staff, and security personnel. As James waited, he found himself thinking about the ceremony he was supposed to attend the next day. How could he honor his fallen comrades without the very items that represented their sacrifice? An hour passed, then 2. Security footage was reviewed, showing James boarding the plane with his bag but no clear evidence of what happened to it afterward. The aircraft had already been cleaned and prepared for its next flight, and a thorough search revealed nothing. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said finally, "I'm going to be completely honest with you. We cannot locate your bag at this time. However, I want you to know that we're treating this as our highest priority. We're reviewing all security footage and interviewing every staff member who was on that flight." James felt something crack inside his chest. Not anger, but a deep, profound sadness. Those weren't just personal belongings in that bag. They were sacred trusts, memorials to men who had died believing their sacrifice would be remembered and honored. "I understand these things happen," James said quietly, though his voice carried a weight that made Sarah shift uncomfortably. "But that medal, it doesn't belong to me. Not really. It belongs to every soldier who didn't come home. And those photographs, those letters from families thanking me for bringing their sons back, how do I replace something like that?" Sarah was clearly moved by his words. "Sir, we're going to do everything in our power to find your belongings. In the meantime, I'd like to offer you compensation for your trouble and upgrade you to first class for your return flight." James shook his head sadly. "You don't understand. I don't want compensation or upgrades. I just want the items that connect me to the men who trusted me to remember them." As James walked away from the customer service desk, he had no idea that Sarah was already on the phone with her regional manager, who was calling the corporate office, who was about to make a call that would eventually reach some very important ears indeed. Sometimes, when an ordinary person is treated with extraordinary disrespect, the ripples spread much further than anyone could have imagined. The ceremony was tomorrow, and James would have to face the families of fallen heroes empty-handed, carrying only his memories of their sacrifice. It felt like the ultimate betrayal of trust, and for the first time since Margaret's death, the old soldier found himself struggling not to weep. The Edinburgh hotel room felt unnaturally quiet as James sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in his hands. He had been trying for the past hour to find the right words to call Colonel Patricia Henderson, the organizer of tomorrow's memorial ceremony. How could he explain that the very symbols of honor and remembrance that were meant to be the centerpiece of the event had simply vanished into the bureaucratic maze of airline operations? Finally, he dialed her number. "Colonel." Henderson answered on the second ring, her crisp military bearing evident even over the phone. "James, I was just thinking about you. I trust your flight went well?" James closed his eyes, gathering his courage. "Patricia, I'm afraid I have some rather distressing news. There's been an incident with my luggage, and I've lost some very important items." "Lost items? What sort of items?" James took a deep breath. "My Victoria Cross, the photographs of the lads we're honoring tomorrow, and the letters from their families. Everything that was meant to be part of the ceremony." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Colonel Henderson spoke, her voice tight with controlled anger. "James, are you telling me that an airline has lost a Victoria Cross, one of only 358 ever awarded?" "I'm afraid so. I've spent the entire afternoon at the airport, but they seem unable to locate my bag. The customer service manager assured me they're treating it as a priority. But," James's voice trailed off. "This is absolutely outrageous," Colonel Henderson said. "James, I want you to know that you're not facing this alone. Give me the details of exactly what happened, every single detail." James recounted the entire experience, from the dismissive treatment by the flight attendant to the fruitless search at baggage claim. As he spoke, he could hear Colonel Henderson taking notes, occasionally interrupting with sharp questions that revealed her growing fury. "James, I need you to email me everything. The airline name, flight number, names of staff members you interacted with, everything. This is not just about lost luggage. This is about the complete failure to respect a national hero and the sacrifice he represents. After ending the call, James felt both relief and apprehension. He knew Patricia Henderson's reputation. She was not someone who accepted injustice quietly. Within the military community, she was known for her fierce advocacy for veterans' rights and her ability to navigate the corridors of power when necessary. What James didn't know was that Colonel Henderson had immediately placed 3 more phone calls after speaking with him. The first was to General Sir Michael Carrington, a longtime friend who served as an aide to senior members of the royal family. The second was to the editor of the Telegraph, a journalist who had covered military affairs for decades. The third was to the CEO of the airline company. Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate headquarters in London, what had started as a routine customer service issue was rapidly escalating into a corporate crisis. Sarah, the customer service manager from Edinburgh, had filed her report about the missing Victoria Cross, and it had shot up the chain of command like a flare. Marcus Thompson, the airline's chief customer relations officer, found himself in an emergency meeting with the company's legal team and public relations department. The implications were staggering. Not just the monetary value of a Victoria Cross, which was impossible to calculate, but the potential public relations disaster if news of this incident became public. How does a Victoria Cross just disappear? Thompson demanded. These are priceless military artifacts. We're not talking about a lost suitcase here. The head of security operations, a former police officer named Janet Mills, had been reviewing footage and interviewing staff for hours. Sir, we have James Mitchell on camera boarding with his carry-on bag. We have footage of him placing it in the overhead compartment. But after that, it becomes unclear. The flight attendant claims she moved it to another compartment, but we can't find any record of where exactly. What about the flight attendant, the one who moved his bag? Christine Walsh. She's been with us for 8 years, generally good record. But when we interviewed her this afternoon, she became defensive and claimed she couldn't remember the specific details. She insisted she followed normal procedures. Thompson rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. Get Walsh back in, here. And I want every person who was on that aircraft interviewed. Ground crew, cleaning staff, everyone. This doesn't just disappear. What Thompson didn't know was that Christine Walsh was at that very moment sitting in her car in the employee parking lot, making a phone call to her boyfriend Rick Palmer, who worked as a baggage handler at Heathrow. Rick, I think we have a problem, she said, her voice shaking. Remember that black bag you said looked expensive? The one from the Edinburgh flight that we took? Yeah, what about it? You said it was just some old guy's stuff. Rick, there was a Victoria Cross in that bag. A bloody Victoria Cross, do you understand what that means? The silence on Rick's end was deafening. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Christ, Christine. A Victoria Cross? Those are sacred. My grandfather would roll over in his grave. Rick Palmer had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's service in World War II, about the heroes who had earned the Victoria Cross, and the reverence with which such medals should be treated. The realization of what he had done hit him like a physical blow. We have to return it, Christine said. They're interviewing everyone, reviewing footage. They're going to find out. Where is it now? In my flat. I thought we could sell it quietly. But Rick, this isn't just any medal. This belongs to a real hero, someone who saved lives. And there are photographs and letters in there too. Personal things. Rick closed his eyes, thinking of his grandfather's war stories, of the respect that should be shown to military heroes. Christine, we return it tonight. All of it. We figure out how to get it back to that old soldier without getting caught. While Christine and Rick wrestled with their consciences, James Mitchell sat in his hotel room, preparing his speech for the next day's ceremony. Without the photographs and letters, he would have to rely on memory alone to honor his fallen comrades. It seemed inadequate, but it was all he had left. He began writing notes about each of the 6 men they would be remembering. Private Tommy Wilson, who had shielded 2 wounded soldiers with his own body. Sergeant David Mackay, who had crawled through enemy fire to rescue trapped civilians. Corporal James Robertson, barely 20 years old when he gave his life to save his entire unit. Each name carried a story. Each story represented a family that had been forever changed. As James wrote, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. Tomorrow he would stand before these families without the tangible symbols of their son's sacrifice, but he would ensure their stories were told with the honor and respect they deserved. It was the least he could do, even if his voice would be the only testament to their heroism. Unknown to James, forces were already in motion that would transform his quiet dignity in the face of injustice into something much larger. Sometimes, when good people are treated badly, other good people step forward to make things right. The morning of the memorial ceremony dawned gray and drizzling, as if the Scottish weather itself was reflecting James's somber mood. He stood before the hotel bathroom mirror, adjusting his dark suit and regimental tie with the same precision he had maintained throughout his military career. The empty space in his jacket pocket where his Victoria Cross should have rested felt like a physical ache. At Edinburgh Castle, the ceremony preparations were underway in the Crown Square. Colonel Henderson had insisted on moving forward despite the missing memorabilia, but James could see the concern in her eyes when she greeted him at the castle entrance. "Any word from the airline?" she asked quietly. James shook his head. "Nothing concrete. They assure me they're still searching, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood that each passing hour made recovery less likely. The families of the fallen soldiers had begun to arrive, and James felt the familiar tightness in his chest as he saw their faces. Mrs. Wilson, Tommy's mother, now in her 80s but still carrying herself with the dignity of a military wife. The Mackay family, including David's teenage daughter who had never known her father but carried his photograph everywhere. Young Mrs. Robertson, who had been pregnant when her husband died and now stood beside her 20-year-old son who bore a striking resemblance to his fallen father. James greeted each family with the warmth and respect they deserved, but inside he felt like he was failing them. How could he honor their loved ones without the very symbols that proved their sacrifice had been recognized at the highest levels? Meanwhile, 90 miles away in London, an extraordinary conversation was taking place in Buckingham Palace. General Sir Michael Carrington was briefing King Charles III on what the palace staff had begun referring to as the Victoria Cross incident. "Your Majesty," General Carrington said, "this is not simply a case of lost luggage. James Mitchell is one of our most distinguished living recipients of the Victoria Cross. His actions in Afghanistan saved 8 lives, and his subsequent work with veterans organizations has been exemplary. The treatment he received from this airline represents a failure to recognize the very values our military embodies." King Charles, himself a military man with deep respect for service and sacrifice, listened with growing concern. "General, what do we know about this ceremony he's attending today?" "A memorial service for 6 soldiers from his former regiment, all killed in action. Mr. Mitchell was planning to share their stories using photographs and personal letters. These weren't just his possessions, Your Majesty. They were historical documents and family treasures." The king was quiet for a moment, staring out at the palace gardens. Finally he spoke. "General, I believe it's time we remind people of the debt we owe to our service members, both living and fallen. Make the necessary arrangements." Back in Edinburgh, James was struggling through his speech. Without the photographs to show and the letters to read, he found himself relying on raw emotion and memory. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke about Tommy Wilson's final moments, about David Mackay's courage under impossible odds, about young James Robertson's sacrifice. "These men," James said to the gathered families and military officials, "didn't seek glory or recognition. They simply did what they believed was right, even when it cost them everything. Today I had hoped to share with you the tangible proof of how their sacrifice was honored, but sometimes the most important things cannot be held in our hands, they must be carried in our hearts." Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while David Mackay's daughter reached out to squeeze her mother's hand. The ceremony was moving forward with dignity and grace, but everyone present could feel the absence of what should have been there. Just as James was concluding his remarks, Colonel Henderson received an urgent phone call. She stepped away discreetly, but James noticed her expression change from surprise to something approaching amazement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced after ending the call, "I've just received word that we have some unexpected but very welcome visitors joining us today." James looked confused, as did the gathered families. Colonel Henderson's smile was growing broader by the moment. "It seems that news of yesterday's unfortunate incident has reached the very highest levels of our government and military. We are about to be honored by a visit from His Majesty King Charles III, who wishes to personally address the treatment of Mr. Mitchell and to honor all our fallen heroes." A collective gasp rose from the assembled group. James felt his knees weaken slightly. The king himself was coming here now. Within minutes, the sound of helicopters could be heard approaching Edinburgh Castle. Royal protection officers had already arrived and were coordinating with local security. The small, intimate memorial service was about to become something unprecedented. James found himself in a state of controlled panic. Meeting the king while wearing his Victoria Cross was one thing. Meeting him empty-handed, with nothing to show for the sacrifice of the men they were honoring, was quite another. "James," Colonel Henderson said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm, "His Majesty specifically requested to meet you. He's aware of what happened with your luggage, and I believe he has something to say about it." As the royal helicopter touched down on the castle esplanade, James straightened his shoulders with the bearing that had served him throughout his military career. If the King of England wanted to meet him, he would face that meeting with the same courage he had shown on the battlefield, even if he felt utterly unprepared for what was about to unfold. The families of the fallen soldiers stood in respectful silence, many of them overwhelmed by the unexpected honor of royal recognition for their loved one's sacrifice. Mrs. Wilson, despite her advanced age, stood straighter than she had in years, pride for her son shining through her tears. As King Charles emerged from the helicopter, accompanied by his security detail and several military aides, James felt the surreal nature of the moment wash over him. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been treated like an inconvenience by airline staff. Now the monarch himself was walking across the ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle, specifically to address that treatment. The king approached the small gathering with the measured steps of someone accustomed to formal occasions, yet there was something unmistakably personal in his demeanor. He had chosen to come here not as a matter of royal protocol, but as a statement about values and respect. "Mr. Mitchell," King Charles said, extending his hand as he approached James, "I understand you've had quite an ordeal. I felt it was important to come here today not just to meet you, but to ensure that the sacrifice you and these families represent is given the respect it deserves." James, despite decades of military training and protocol, found himself momentarily speechless. "Your Majesty, this is completely unexpected. I'm honored, but really this ceremony is about these fallen heroes, not about my troubles with an airline." "Mr. Mitchell," the king replied, "your troubles with that airline represent something much larger. They represent a society that has, perhaps, forgotten the debt it owes to people like you and these brave soldiers we're here to honor today." The king turned to address the assembled families, his voice carrying clearly across the castle courtyard. "I want each of you to know that your loved one's sacrifice has not been forgotten at the highest levels of our nation. Their courage in the face of danger, their willingness to put others before themselves, these are the values upon which our country is built." As the king spoke, James noticed something extraordinary happening. Royal aides were quietly setting up a small display table, and on it, they were placing items that made James's heart skip a beat. There, gleaming in the Scottish morning light, was his Victoria Cross medal. Beside it were the photographs of his fallen comrades, the letters from their families, and every single item that had been in his missing bag. James stared in disbelief. "Your Majesty, where did these come from?" King Charles smiled, and for a moment the formal distance between monarch and subject seemed to disappear. "Mr. Mitchell, it seems that your experience yesterday touched the conscience of some people who made very poor choices. Early this morning, your belongings were delivered to Buckingham Palace by two very remorseful airline employees who wanted to ensure you had them for today's ceremony. The truth was even more remarkable than James could have imagined. Christine Walsh and Rick Palmer had spent the entire night driving from London to Edinburgh, too ashamed to face James directly but desperate to return what they had stolen. They had left the bag with palace security, along with a written confession and apology, accepting full responsibility for their actions and requesting only that James receive his belongings in time for the ceremony. But more importantly, the king continued, I wanted to be here today to personally apologize for how you were treated. A man who has served his country with such distinction, who carries the Victoria Cross, should never experience the disrespect you encountered yesterday. The king gestured toward the display of recovered items. These objects represent more than military honors, Mr. Mitchell. They represent the bond between those who serve and those who are served, between the living and the fallen, between one generation of heroes and the next. James felt tears welling. The memorial ceremony that followed was unlike anything James had ever experienced in his decades of military service. With his Victoria Cross once again resting in his jacket pocket and the precious photographs and letters displayed before the assembled families, the event took on a profound significance that transcended the original plans. King Charles remained throughout the entire ceremony, listening intently as James shared the stories of each fallen soldier. When James spoke about Tommy Wilson's final act of courage, the king nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of sacrifice that military families carry. When he read from the letter written by David McKay's mother, thanking James for bringing her son's body home, there wasn't a dry eye among the gathering. These men, James said, holding up the photograph of young James Robertson, represent the very best of our nation. They didn't hesitate when duty called, even though they knew the risks. Today, thanks to His Majesty's intervention, their stories can be told with the dignity and completeness they deserve. After the formal ceremony concluded, King Charles spent nearly an hour speaking individually with each family. He listened to Mrs. Wilson's memories of her son's childhood dreams of military service, heard David McKay's daughter talk about following in her father's footsteps by joining the military herself, and spoke with James Robertson's son about the father he had never had the chance to know. Your father's sacrifice, the king told the young man, gave you the freedom to choose your own path in life. That is the greatest gift any parent can give their child. As the families began to disperse, King Charles asked to speak privately with James. They walked together along the ancient battlements of Edinburgh Castle, two men from very different backgrounds united by their understanding of duty and service. Mr. Mitchell, the king began, I want you to understand why I felt compelled to come here today. It wasn't just about your lost luggage, or even about the disrespectful treatment you received. It was about something fundamental to who we are, as a nation. James listened carefully, still somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events. In our modern world, the king continued, we sometimes lose sight of the values that truly matter. Honor, sacrifice, respect for those who serve. These aren't outdated concepts. They are the foundation upon which our society rests. When someone like you, a holder of the Victoria Cross, is treated with casual disrespect, it represents a failure that goes far beyond one airline or one incident. The king paused, looking out over the city of Edinburgh spread below them. I wanted to send a clear message today, not just to that airline, but to everyone. Our veterans, our service members, and the families who have sacrificed alongside them deserve our utmost respect and gratitude. James felt deeply moved by the king's words. Your Majesty, your presence here today has meant more to those families than you could possibly know. For many of them, this is the first time their loved one's sacrifice has been acknowledged at such a high level. Mr. Mitchell, that's exactly why I needed to be here. These families, and veterans like yourself, shouldn't have to wait for a crisis to receive the recognition you deserve. Later that afternoon, as James prepared to return to London, he learned the full story of how his belongings had been recovered. Christine Walsh and Rick Palmer had turned themselves in to the authorities, fully confessing to their theft and expressing genuine remorse for their actions. They had voluntarily resigned from their positions and were cooperating fully with the investigation. Sarah, the customer service manager who had tried so hard to help James at Edinburgh Airport, received a personal commendation from the airline's corporate headquarters and was promoted to head of customer relations for Scotland. The airline itself announced a comprehensive review of their customer service policies and established a special protocol for handling complaints from military personnel. Marcus Thompson, the chief customer relations officer, personally called James to apologize and offer compensation. But James declined any financial settlement. Instead, he asked that the airline make a donation to a veterans charity and implement mandatory training on recognizing and respecting military service. "Mr. Mitchell," Thompson said during their conversation, "your grace in handling this situation has taught our entire organization a valuable lesson. We failed you, but your response has made us better." The story of James Mitchell's experience and King Charles's intervention quickly spread throughout British media. Rather than focusing on the negative aspects of the incident, most coverage emphasized the positive outcome and the important message about respecting veterans and their sacrifices. James found himself somewhat uncomfortable with the attention, but he used the platform it provided to speak about the ongoing needs of veterans and military families. "This incident," he told reporters, "is really about something much larger than my personal experience. It's about remembering that behind every uniform, every medal, every military honor, there are real people who have given everything in service to their country." 3 months later, James received an invitation that surprised even him. The airline that had lost his luggage, now under new customer service management, asked him to serve as a consultant on their Veteran Affairs program. They wanted his help in training staff to better recognize and serve military personnel and their families. James accepted the role, seeing it as an opportunity to ensure that other veterans would never face the disrespect and dismissal he had experienced. His first recommendation was simple but profound. Treat every customer with the dignity and respect you would want for your own family members. The memorial service at Edinburgh Castle became an annual event, with James returning each year to honor his fallen comrades. King Charles, true to his word about not forgetting the sacrifice of military families, attended the next 2 ceremonies as well, reinforcing his commitment to honoring those who serve. As James sat in his London home, one evening, nearly a year after the incident, he reflected on how a moment of casual disrespect had ultimately led to something much more meaningful. His Victoria Cross sat in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, alongside the photographs of Tommy Wilson, David Mackay, James Robertson, and the other heroes whose memory he carried. Margaret's chair across from him remained empty, but James no longer felt the crushing loneliness he had experienced in the months after her death. The events of that day in Edinburgh had reconnected him with his sense of purpose and reminded him that his story, like those of his fallen comrades, was part of something larger than himself. The old soldier smiled as he looked at a letter he had received that morning from David Mackay's daughter, now serving as a lieutenant in the Royal Engineers. She wrote, "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for keeping my father's story alive. Because of what happened that day at the castle, I know that his sacrifice will never be forgotten. That knowledge gives me strength every day." James folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others. Some battles, he reflected, are won not through force or anger, but through quiet dignity and the willingness of good people to stand up for what is right. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all.